So as it turns out, the Jimmie Johnson and Fernando Alonso seat swap is more significant to the future of motorsport than we could have possibly imagined when it was first announced. We had a bevy of information become released from both sides of the Atlantic. Fernando Alonso talking a lot about his future for 2019, and Jimmie Johnson talking a lot about his future post-NASCAR. Hint, hint, it includes sports cars and, believe it or not, IndyCar racing. We also had Chase Elliott and Kasey Kahne get in on the action, and there's some interesting things that could be happening with Chase Elliott's future in racing. We're going to be talking about that as well. So what we're going to do is break down every piece of news that came out of the Jimmie Johnson Fernando Alonso seat swap, and let me tell you, I filled up an entire page of notes. This is all pretty significant and interesting information, so let's get right into it. So the first thing we need to talk about is the seat swap itself. It took place at the Bahrain International Circuit, which was a little bit confusing to me until I remembered that Bahrain and a lot of the higher-ups in the country own a significant portion of the McLaren team, so it all makes sense now. The F1 car they tested raised a lot of eyebrows for people not in the know. They used a 2013 car, which was equipped with a V8 Mercedes engine. Now, why was that? Well, it comes down to the very restrictive Formula One rules that began in 2014 with the turbo hybrid era. Testing is very restricted on those particular cars, leading all the way up to the current era models from 2018. And even fun tests like this could give the manufacturer of the engine as well as the manufacturer of the chassis an unfair advantage over the other teams, or at least in Formula One's eyes. And that's why such an old car was used. Fernando Alonso set a 1 minute 40.2 lap time, and that was done without KERS or DRS that would have been used in the era. Jimmie Johnson was only 0.2 of a second off that lap time, and considering he's never raced a Formula One car or even driven a Formula One car before, and I'm not sure he has virtually any open-wheel experience. The last time he may have driven an open-wheel car may have been out in the Baja 1000, and even then, I think he was a truck driver at that point. So yeah, Jimmie Johnson, that was an impressive lap time for him to set, and it certainly gave him a little bit of a bug to do more open-wheel racing, which we'll talk about later. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of this was the actual NASCAR test itself. Jimmie Johnson set a 2 minute 14 lap. Now, it's worth noting that Jimmie Johnson has never been on the Bahrain International Circuit before, but again, he was pretty close to Alonso in terms of the lap times in the Formula One car. Alonso went 4 seconds faster at a 2 minute 10 in the stock car. So that is pretty significant. Now, I know a lot of people will say, well, it's just for fun, and a lot of times in these seat swaps, because of the fact that the driver who's actually switching into the other seat will get more seat time throughout the day, of course they're going to go faster at the end of the day. But you have to consider that Alonso, I think, has never been in a car this heavy or this powerful before in terms of the way a stock car is configured. In fact, I think the heaviest car he's ever been in was his Indy 500 car in 2017. So the fact that he was able to essentially smack Jimmie down in this car is very, very significant, despite the fact that, yes, he has kind of the circuit knowledge here. Again, he's never been in a car this heavy at all. So that was really an eye-opener. And you've got to think, and we're going to talk about this a bit later as well, that if Fernando is thinking about doing some NASCAR races next year, he might want to consider a road race, because although I don't think Jimmie Johnson's really ever been thought of as a road racer himself or somebody who's, you know, kind of always a threat on the road courses, when you look at that lap time, that's significant from Fernando Alonso to put down that big of a lap. And again, we don't really have a whole lot else other than Jimmie Johnson's lap as a measuring stick. Obviously, NASCAR has never, and probably will never, race at the Bahrain International Circuit. But we weren't the only ones impressed by Alonso's lap time. Jimmie Johnson himself was impressed. So much so that he really, really wants to do the Rolex 24 with Fernando Alonso. It would be his first return to the race since 2008 when he drove for Bob Stallings Racing. And Jimmie Johnson has always had a bit of a soft spot in his heart for the Rolex 24. It's kind of been a bit unfortunate that he's missed so many of those races, because it seems like he really enjoys doing that. And the potential of having Jimmie Johnson and Fernando Alonso teaming on the same team would be pretty freaking awesome. Speaking of the Rolex 24, Fernando Alonso will make his second start in the event next year, and the significance of this announcement is that he will be joining Wayne Taylor Racing, as well as Kamui Kobayashi, his Toyota Racing teammate from the LMP1 program. They'll be teaming with the regular drivers Jordan Taylor and Renger van de Zande. The Cadillac is the best car at the Rolex 24. They've won the last 2 races. Wayne Taylor won in 2017, one with a star driver, that being Jeff Gordon, and then last year it was Action Express Racing with a number 5 Mustang sampling car. Now, it says a lot to Toyota for this to happen. The fact that not only has Alonso been allowed to do this, but also Kamui Kobayashi, because it says to me that Toyota did or doesn't have the same restrictions that a lot of other manufacturers put on their factory drivers, that they are allowed to go to other makes, other manufacturers, other brands and race, providing that they're not competing directly with another manufacturer of Toyotas. Now, Toyota will be at the Rolex 24. They'll be in GT3 with the Lexus program, but obviously direct competition-wise, they're not going to be competing with the Cadillacs. And again, like I said, the Cadillacs are the best car. Wayne Taylor Racing may be the best team in IMSA. They're certainly one of the better ones in the endurance races. They won the most recent one at the Petit Le Mans, so they already are going to go into the Rolex 24 with a huge advantage. Then you add 2 Le Mans winners to that lineup with Alonso and Kobayashi. That's amazing. I mean, might as well hand him the trophy now, because I'm not sure anybody, assuming they don't have any mechanical faults, will be able to beat them. And speaking of, racefans.net had a bit of a scoop revealing that Fernando Alonso is going to become somewhat of a GM factory driver for next year, as evidenced by his Cadillac signing and the fact that it's more or less confirmed that Chevrolet will power his McLaren at this year's Indianapolis 500. Now, this opens up an incredible amount of possibilities for Fernando Alonso. Remember, he's talked an awful lot about moving on to other series and really kind of cherry-picking some of the bigger events in the motorsports calendar over the year 2019. Now, obviously, Chevrolet, like we said, is in IndyCar racing, so he's going to do the Indianapolis 500. There's been some speculation from guys like Marshall Pruitt that Alonso would do at least one other race, possibly the Grand Prix of Indianapolis, to kind of prepare the McLaren team, get some pit stops in, get kind of a feel of the competition, get a feel of the new Indy cars, because of course they have changed significantly since the last time he raced them, despite the fact that he tested one at Barber Motorsports Park. Again, testing doesn't necessarily prepare you for going out there with 26 to 33 opponents in race conditions. There's also the possibility, because of where GM's motorsport interests lie, that a General Motors product, aka a Chevrolet, could be a place he could land in NASCAR. And looking at that lap time he set against Jimmie Johnson head-to-head, you've got to think that there's at least something in the back of his mind, if not doing the Daytona 500, because I'm still not sure that's going to happen this year. He needs some Super Speedway NASCAR experience, despite the Super Speedway IndyCar experience. Obviously, racing a stock car on a high-speed track is a lot different than racing an IndyCar, and I think you would need a lot more experience to be able to really take a good crack at the Daytona 500. But doing a NASCAR race itself, I think, would be very likely this year. You got to think that he would either go to Watkins Glen or maybe even the Charlotte Roval. I think there may be a bit of a conflict between Le Mans and the Sonoma race, so I'm not sure that would be able to work. But yeah, I mean, if he doesn't want to do a road course race in stock cars, he could also go to the land down under, Australia. Holden is a GM brand, and if he wanted to do the Bathurst 1000, I'm sure that Holden and one of their many teams in that series would be able to find him a ride. And that means that Fernando Alonso would be, I believe, the first driver ever to run the Rolex 24, the 12 hours of Sebring, or the Sebring 1000 miles, but let's face it, it's the 12 hours of Sebring just doing it again. The Indy 500, the Bathurst 1000, and Le Mans all in the same year. No one's ever done that before, and if he adds a NASCAR race to that, that's very significant. Speaking of IndyCar racing, Jimmie Johnson is talking about going IndyCar racing. These are the kind of things that just make my freaking head spin, but Jimmie Johnson seems pretty resigned to the fact that at the end of his Hendrick Motorsports contract in 2020, he is very much going to be a free agent. And if you look at the writing on the wall, it certainly seems like Hendrick Motorsports is starting to move away from Jimmie Johnson. That's why they moved Chad Knaus over to William Byron's team. They want to bring the next generation up, and they don't want to necessarily be held down keeping around Jimmie Johnson if his career is falling off the way kind of we seem to be seeing it. Jimmie Johnson clearly still wants to race. The Rolex 24 talk, I believe, is absolutely 100% serious, especially if he can team with Fernando Alonso. IndyCar racing. Now, he revealed that he doesn't want to do ovals. He apparently has offers on the table right now to do the Indy 500 if he wanted to do them. He doesn't want to do the Indy 500. He stated in the past that his wife doesn't want him to do it. He's got a beautiful family. I don't necessarily disagree with him deciding against running IndyCar ovals. It is a big risk. But what he does want to do are IndyCar road races, and that's just a mind blower right there. Now, how exactly he would go about this or what tracks he would run would be up in the air. I don't think this is going to happen before his contract ends out. Otherwise, he wouldn't have kind of made that stipulation or at least talked about 2020 or the end of 2020, meaning the 2021 season would be when he would jump in an IndyCar. But I have to think that this is probably going to happen. It really does seem like he caught the open wheel bug by jumping in that Formula One car. And I will admit, he did look pretty good in that seat with the Jimmie Johnson helmet, and it did look good with the 48 on an open wheel car. I hope he runs the Grand Prix of Indianapolis. It's kind of a blessing in disguise that race exists, because even if we can't see Jimmie Johnson in the Indianapolis 500, I know selfishly that's what I would want to see. But again, I understand his familial concerns, and I don't blame him at all that comes first. But I think Jimmie Johnson in a lot of ways reminds me of Rick Mears, one of the greatest IndyCar Indy 500 drivers of all time. Mears is one of the 4-time winners and one of the fastest drivers really ever at the Speedway. And Jimmie kind of came up that same direction. He kind of has that same thought process in terms of racing. He came up the Baja 1000 route, the off-road truck racing, and found his way into kind of proper circuit racing. No offense to the dirt endurance guys out there, but that's kind of an interesting path. It's an interesting comparison, and I think he'll struggle early on unless he does a lot of testing. But again, if Jimmie is kind of looking to Fernando Alonso for inspiration, Alonso has committed himself fully when he goes to do Le Mans or Indianapolis, and certainly the Rolex 24. You got to imagine if Jimmie is taking inspiration from that, he'll prepare as much as possible for his IndyCar debut. And finally, Kasey Kahne gets the seat swap fever. He wants Jimmie Johnson and Chase Elliott in a World of Outlaws sprint car. And almost immediately, Chase Elliott responded with, "Let's get serious." So, not to be outdone, but we're talking about IndyCar, we're talking about Formula One, we're talking about WEC, we're talking about the Rolex 24. Hey, the sprint car guys wanted in on it. And Kasey Kahne has offered open wheel testing to Chase Elliott and Jimmie Johnson. So certainly Kasey Kahne already has a Napa Auto Parts sprint car in his stable. I believe Brad Sweet drives it. I think that was who replied in the comments to that one. I'm sorry, I don't keep up as much with the World of Outlaws. But that being said, I mean, it seems picture perfect. It seems like if they wanted to do this, they would be able to do it. Now, would Rick Hendrick necessarily agree to this, particularly considering what impact Chase Elliott seems to have on NASCAR as a whole, and certainly on Hendrick Motorsports? He certainly seems like at the moment, especially considering his hot streak at the end of the season last year, as really the man going forward at Hendrick Motorsports. But you have to admit, and I hope Rick Hendrick would see it this way, how cool it would be to see Chase Elliott, and certainly as well Jimmie Johnson, be able to sling some dirt as well. Bill Elliott, Chase's father, was very active in getting into other forms of motorsports. He tested a Chip Ganassi Racing IndyCar at Michigan International Speedway and actually ran somewhere in the range of 225 miles an hour, which was right up there with the front runners. It's kind of a shame that we never saw Bill Elliott run an IndyCar race. But as well, Bill Elliott also ran the Rolex 24. He ran for Roush Racing and a few other teams in the GT category. I think he may have actually won one year. So it's going to be cool to see. I hope this happens because I would love to see, I love to see this kind of revitalization of everybody doing everything. I think it's good for the sport. I think when everybody is kind of declining, everybody's either stagnant like IndyCar or F1 is, or declining like NASCAR is, I think everybody's stars kind of getting in everybody else's pie, so to speak, is good for everybody, because you're not just going to have F1 stars, you're not just going to have IndyCar stars, you're not going to just have NASCAR stars or sports car stars, you're going to have everybody stars. You're going to have auto racing stars. Everybody will know who the best drivers are in the world, not just the best drivers in F1, best drivers in NASCAR, best drivers in IndyCar. And really, in this current era, I think that's almost a getting back to basics sort of thing. That's kind of the thing that kind of drove the sport forward in the 1960s. So seeing the fact that Fernando Alonso, along with Jimmie Johnson in this case, have been able to kind of bring that back, I mean, it's only good things for the sport. So we've had a lot to go over in this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to leave a like on it for more motorsport content. Let me know what you think about any of this. Jimmie Johnson going to IndyCar, Chase Elliott going to sprint cars, Alonso going to every race in the freaking worldwide, or the wide world of sports. It's going to be incredible. This is going to be a lot of fun over the next 3 years to see exactly where all these dominoes fall. But yeah, I'll be along for the ride, so subscribe, and we'll be covering as much of this stuff as we can. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.